So today, welcome to the world of Wii U.
Have you ever messed something up so bad you had to go back and do it a second time? Maybe it was a botched home-cooked dinner, or perhaps a project for art class. You turn in an okay but clearly flawed D+ drawing on the due date, and the teacher says, "Look, I know you can do better. I'll give you a few days extension to make it good." So a few days later, you turn in a better A-grade drawing. It's late, but the teacher is happy with it. Let's rewind. What if you had the better drawing in your backpack this whole time? What if you knew and purposefully held on to the good drawing while turning in the bad one on the due date? Why would you do that?
It's a caveman.
He survived 1,000,000 years. Now can he survive high school?
It's September 1995. The Sega Saturn launched in the United States more than 4 months ago, staggered from region to region. Not everyone got it right away on May 11th. Supplies were very limited. A Now 404 Business Wire article showed it took until September 2nd to complete the national rollout. So even though E3 boasted a surprise launch, finding a Saturn could be like a quest for a mythical artifact.
It's out there.
Anyone who did manage to find it, or just get it mail-ordered, were greeted with the pack-in port of the arcade smash hit Virtua Fighter. The cabinet has stood proudly in the arcades since late 1993, loudly redefining the future of video games. For the first time, players controlled three-dimensional avatars who moved just like real people, vividly capturing the human anatomy and its movements. It's the godfather of 3D fighting games.
Around that time, the president of Sega realized that Capcom had a fighting game called Street Fighter II, and that was very popular, and he was very concerned that Sega was always losing to competitors in the fighting game area. So he asked me if I could come up with a game that could be competitive in the field. And I said, I don't know if I'll be successful, but of course, I'll give it a try.
There existed nothing like it. No other video game company was doing this. To top off the technological tank, the 3-button fighter played pretty well for the time. Its block punch kick directional input system was easy to understand, but took time to master every move. Arcade goers would pour hours into learning each combo, treating their favorite character as a martial arts extension of the self. Fast-paced matches make for a great spectator sport, with comebacks and perfect sweeps, fueled by an unquenchable thirst for competition. Virtua Fighter solidified Sega as a king. Nothing like it had ever been seen in the arcades. Moving through 1994, getting this level of 3D crammed into a home console seemed like an impossible stretch to some. Star Fox on the Super Nintendo and Virtua Racing on the Genesis were pretty impressive feats, but they didn't have nearly the same level of sophistication as Virtua Fighter. They also lagged like dragon ass. The amount of cartridge Frankensteining it took to make these games work got pretty expensive, and they still didn't touch the technical quality of what we're seeing here. So imagine the shock video game fans felt when they saw this in late 94, Virtua Fighter running on Sega's next home console. Also shocking because of the weird-ass cone heads.
Ready, go!
It launched in Japan with the console in November of 94. Players and writers who imported copies are wowed by the port. Sure, it has several graphical dropouts and other weird issues, but it's home, and for the time, that was impressive enough. Outside the homestead, Sega already unleashed Virtua Fighter 2 in the arcades. Much better looking graphics with texture-mapped characters. This seemed to be a long way from being playable on any home console, but at the very least, it showed a bright future for Sega. Meanwhile, a cauldron began stirring at Namco, one of Sega's longtime arcade rivals. They liked Virtua Fighter so much, they poached some of Sega's developers to make their own kung fu spectacle. Namco cleverly teamed up with Sony, striking a software deal. It was for the electronic company's first video game machine. Shigeru Yokohama told Next Generation, Tekken is being developed on what they're calling System 11, a PlayStation chipset optimized for the arcade. He said, quote, "It can be ported straight over," saying the two chipsets have a relationship similar to Sega's STV and Saturn. Namco wanted to beat Sega at their own game. Tekken cabinets started invading arcades in late 94 and early 95, and it looked good. It's showing the video game world that PlayStation's fighter will have fluid movements, clean graphics, and texture maps right out of the gate. Sega's home console port of Virtua Fighter does not compare well.
Oh, it's the Friday Night Flavor on V100.
As the summer of 95 flies by and progresses into fall, hardcore Western Sega fans are starting to get frustrated. Games are slowly trickling into the software drought, and with that long staggered console release I mentioned earlier, many fans can't even find a Saturn. At the same time, they're seeing what Tekken will look like, worried Sega won't keep up in the at-home battle. While not an incredible game, Sony's console did launch with Battle Arena Toshinden, another 3D fighter with texture mapping. Its host of other non-fighter launch games also boast impressive graphics. Do you think Sony would invest millions of dollars in the video game market to make games that suck?
Yes, homie.
Tekken has been out in Japan since March and is due on American shelves by November. Sega needs to show Saturn can do this too. They need to prove this motherboard can produce a Tekken killer, and they don't have time to wait for VF2's port. So in late September of 1995, Sega of America shipped out an interactive apology letter.
Fight 1. Ready. PandaMonium.
Remix has this common elevator pitch: a reskin of Saturn's Virtua Fighter. The original has all the fast-paced gameplay elements which make Virtua Fighter a fun time, but it still looked like a 1993 game. In fact, it even looked a little worse. Throughout this video, I'll be referring to the 3 different Virtua Fighters in shorter words. When I say arcade, I'm talking about the 93 arcade original. When I say pack-in, I'm talking about the first Saturn port. Excellent. And then when I say remix, I'm obviously talking about Virtua Fighter Remix. Just by comparing the intros, you can see the visual difference is staggering. The pack-in fighters look blocky and flat, with joints that appear unnatural when bending. This look is forgivable when you remember their initial goal was to make it a one-to-one recreation of the 93 arcade cabinet. That's a job the pack-in can do well, but you can still see flaws when comparing it to the arcade original. Polygons flicker and sometimes disappear or glitch out. They appear less defined, and the frame-to-frame animation suffers. In a time when the arcade's newest Virtua Fighter looks like this, and Tekken on console looks like this, you would expect Saturn's Virtua Fighter to look a little better. While the press didn't seem to mind at first, both writers and fans quickly connected the dots. The pack-in was underpowered. Throughout May and June, no Tekken killer emerged from the rings of Saturn. Strangely enough, Sega likely had a Tekken killer this whole time. Rumors about what Remix was began circulating the internet during E3, the same day of Saturn's surprise launch. Several people reported seeing Virtua Fighter Remix in action, tucked away in a corner at the expo. Marty Chin, a videographer, is said to have recorded a couple rounds at the show in his 1995 E3 video. His produced video about the expo was distributed and sold to fans online. It's not known if this footage is still around, but if anyone has it, I'd be happy to post a link. The people who saw it, either at E3 or on Chin's footage, describe what we know today, saying it's the original VF, but with textures and no clipping problems. The multiple witness accounts suggest Remix was in a playable state. Sega was showing it off to the public the same day Saturn launched in North America with the lesser pack-in Virtua Fighter. Some were excited as hell about Remix. Marty Chin even called it the best Saturn game he saw on the show floor. Others were upset, or just didn't care. In their mind, it would be like paying $60 for the same game. Some hoped it would be sold at a reduced price, In an IRC interview, Chin was asked if he knew what Sega was going to do with Remix. He said they did not know. His understanding was they just wanted to show off the Saturn's potential. In the Tronix E3 video, they panned down a list of upcoming Saturn games. Virtua Fighter Remix was not on there. At the end of May, about 2 weeks later, someone online said they called customer service, asking Sega, "What is Remix?" The employee said she never heard of it. On June 7th, a Game Zero co-editor called Sega reps to get some solid answers. The rep told him it was, quote, accidentally shown at the show, saying it was just the work of producers testing out the technology. It is not a game, and it will not be available on store shelves. People in Japan saw it on store shelves later that month.
Ready, go!
On June 22nd, this Tronix employee talked about opening and playing an import of Remix for 10 minutes. They were testing a modified console before shipping it to the customer. Other strangers were straight up posting reviews. June is also when the STV cartridge of Remix shipped out, according to the Sega Arcade History book from Famitsu DC. Files on a Japanese version of Remix show it was last modified on May 19, 1995, essentially finished on that day. So it would be very possible for Sega to show this off on May 11th, even if it wasn't necessarily a complete build. Theoretically, if the company really wanted to, they could have launched the American Saturn with Remix. It was practically done. So why didn't they? E3 visitors were wondering the same thing. Keep in mind, they were also showing the Saturn's Virtua Fighter 2 at E3, but only footage of the port was shown. No playable demo in sight. Obviously, the arcade cabs were there, but they'd been commercially released for months. They did show footage of other unreleased Saturn games, but they were already out in Japan, like Astal for instance. It's footage of the Japanese Astal, since it shows more than 3 hit points allowed in the American version.
Ready, go!
By midsummer, ambitious collectors and the press started getting their hands on Japan's Remix, showing fans a night and day difference. Perhaps there's no better vehicle for comparison than Akira, the star of the series. On Akira's Remix arm, you can see the muscle details hide polygon edges very well, while Pack-In Akira makes no effort to mask the flat, single-colored rectangles. They often flicker and disappear as the camera moves, abruptly popping in and out, changing light shades at a jarring pace. Stuff you don't see at all on the Remix arm. His outfit is another big difference, looking more natural and vibrant on Remix. The chest has bulging muscles with slight wrinkles in the shirt. His headband on the Pack-In almost melts into his forehead. His Remix head appears more fierce and realistic. Did I mention he also has fingers instead of flesh mittens? Saturn! On August 2nd, Sega of America promised to deliver a free copy of Remix to any registered Saturn owners. They had to call 1-800-C-SATURN by midnight on September 30th in order to qualify. Such a promotion was considered uncommon by many fans, so naturally, it made people happy. Players in the East Coast reported getting their free copies in the mail on September 26th. That's also when stores started selling localized American copies, all while new Saturn consoles were starting to come with Remix instead of the original Pack-In. To make matters even better for Sega fans, by October 2nd, the price of their console dropped from a whopping $399 to $299.
If you buy a Sega Saturn before September 30th, you get 3 free games! That's $150 value!
By the end of the weekend, Sega will begin offering up more than what Sony does for the same price, beating Tekken in the race to American couches. So does the gameplay in Remix live up? Short answer, yes. It's the same as before. Pack-In already had a great engine for Saturn. It just needed some serious polish. Remix is the polish. The instruction manual for Remix shows more moves per character than the Pack-In's manual, but the movesets are all the same. If you see a move in Remix, it was already in the Pack-In. Sega claims they tweaked the gameplay and controller response time. I decided to test this out by comparing the two versions using the same string of combos in a 2-player match. Every test I conducted showed the exact same gameplay patterns down to the frame. I won't go over every test in this video, but I'll show you one example. This is being captured on a real Sega Saturn in S-Video at exactly 30 frames per second. In this test, I used the same combos in the same order with Sarah against Player 2's Jackie on Jeffrey's stage. Player 2 is just a controller on the floor, so the Bryant brother is essentially a test dummy. For this test, I move Sarah forward until her right foot is on the center line. She starts with her signature somersault kick combo, a jumping stomp to follow, the pinwheel kick by itself, deliver the knee of justice, and end with the neck breaker. No, I am not a machine, but you will find each move individually matches up precisely.
Fight 1. Ready, go!
Going frame by frame with the somersault kick combo. The 3 punches wind back and hit in the exact same spots, with Jackie reacting to them exactly as he does in the pack-in. The pinwheel kick that follows in this combo meets Jackie's face exactly 20 frames in on both. Sarah descends with both feet on the ground at 35 frames. Jackie hits the floor the same way. I physically pressed up and B to follow with the stomp shortly before this point. You can see in both games, the inputs are activated at precisely 58 frames. The only difference I noticed is the in-game camera in Remix takes a little bit longer to swing into position as Sarah rises, zooming in for the stomp at a slightly different time. But the model movements are still an exact match. Sarah's model has one visual difference at frame 61, but this appears to be a discrepancy caused by the capture equipment. If anything, it's the only model difference I noticed, meaning very, very minimal changes were made to the gameplay, if at all. Jackie takes the hit and curls up in pain as Sarah rolls away. Even her ponytail unwinds in the same position each frame. In Remix, the camera is positioned closer to the action, likely so you, the player, can get a better view of the new character models. The rest of the individual moves in this sequence yielded the same results. I, of course, do not have the surgical precision to start them at the exact same time, but when isolated, they match. Even the neck breaker at the end sent me off stage in both. My tests conclude, this is indeed the same engine with only cosmetic modifications. I cannot find a single gameplay difference, even though Sega claimed they enhanced the gameplay. Again, I'm not a robot, so I cannot properly test controller response times, but in my comparison of the two games, I didn't notice any input differences. For good measure, I also decided to test the AI in arcade mode. I recorded multiple first rounds against Jackie with Akira on normal difficulty default time settings, all starting after a system reset. In every round, all I did was hold right. You can see in both versions, Jackie appears to respond to me moving right in two different yet similar ways, both represented in the pack-in and in Remix. He always starts with the neck breaker. It seems that whichever of the two routines he goes with are decided by what the second move is. In routine 1, his second move is a pinwheel kick, whereas in routine 2, his second move is a basic punch. But in both routines, Jackie still has very similar responses to me holding right without letting go for the entire match. And you can see they're both present in both versions. Actually, it's the same game. Likewise, Virtua Fighter fans have said for decades it's the same game with different graphics, which is not a big problem at all because the gameplay has always been
Excellent!
even on pack-in. The fighting itself is more than serviceable. Remix is a terrific way to experience Virtua Fighter. The default 30-second clock is plenty of time. The action really moves that fast. When deciding on your champion, you get a different package with each fighter. You like fast, quick hitters like me? You got options. Do you like getting complex and technical? If so, you're covered. How about slow yet powerful beefcakes? Canadian Karaoke Man has your back, while breaking others. Whether it's wrestling or complex martial arts, there's probably a moveset that fits your fighting style. Unlike Street Fighter and other popular genre titles of the time, Virtua Fighter does away with projectiles, focusing on up-close combat. Because of this, fast reflexes and opportunistic timing are a must. Each unique moveset has its own properties that can respond to attacks, overpower, and even counter certain moves. Figuring out and learning these properties for your character of choice is something that comes with a lot of time and practice. It's also the first major fighting game with ring outs, allowing you to beat your opponent by pressuring them off the arena.
Ring out!
Once you've selected your champion, it's time to work your way through arcade mode. While you have unlimited continues, you only get one chance to defeat the final boss, Dural. This clothingless metal machine takes a moveset from one of the other fighters at random. Defeat her in 1 credit, and you become the Virtua Best. Like before, there's a 2-player mode to test your skills against friends. Don't like the settings? You have the freedom to change them. Virtua Fighter set a powerful standard, one that the arcade, Pack-In, and Remix all meet when it comes to gameplay. But with Remix, it looks so much better. On the downside, it appears a few minor graphical sacrifices were made. While not terrible, one of the greatest examples is Sarah's stage. It has floor lights. In the Pack-In, the models show a smooth shading transition, bright on bottom, darker on top.
Fight! 1.
On Remix, the characters do not have this lighting effect, making them look unnaturally bright. Polygon glitches were one of the Pack-In's biggest issues. In Remix, this was vastly improved. They still pop out on occasion, but it happens a lot less. You almost have to look for it in order to see it happen. Fun fact! Remix does have a higher polygon count than the Pack-In. However, the arcade original has a higher polygon count than both Saturn ports, even though it lacks Remix's textures. Remix may be late to the party, but it delivers. And when it finally hit Western shelves, it was very well received by critics. It scored a 5 out of 5 stars from Next Generation, a rare score from them. They said it can now trade blows with Tekken and Toshinden. Comically, their review starts by talking about how any console's first games won't be impressive because the developers are inexperienced with the system. But Sega already had Remix. Immediately following a Tekken ad, which reads, "Buy the right one," GamePro slapped Remix with a 4.5 out of 5, saying it will be hard to top. Its 2 editors for a day also gave it glowing scores, but believe it's less polished than Tekken and isn't enough to convert gamers to Saturn. I can't seem to find anyone who gave it a bad review. Virtually everyone recognized it as a vast improvement to Pack-In. The only major complaint was that it didn't come out sooner. So why did Sega hold on to Remix? Let's rewind and go over the dates we know. On May 11th, a fully playable version of the game, referred to as Virtua Fighter Remix, was shown at E3 in North America. About a week later, Sega of Japan finished the commercial release of the game. While Japan is seemingly in the process of shipping this game, multiple representatives with Sega of America are telling customers and journalists that the game doesn't exist, or was an experimental project not meant to be shown at E3. Within a couple of weeks of those statements, Remix came out in Japan. Was it a giant miscommunication between Sega of Japan and America? Could Remix have feasibly launched with the American Saturn in May? Was it planned for the original September launch? We don't know.
There's a lot of competition, Virtua Fighter, a lot of fighting games. There's a lot of trash talkers out there. But, you try to hold your own on that.
It's tough to say when exactly Sega started making it. Both Tekken and Pack-In VF were out for their respective home consoles in Japan by March of '95. We know Remix is building off of the already finished Pack-In, so development time for Remix could not have been that long. We know VF2 for Saturn was likely in development since it had snapshots shown that summer. Remix could have been a knee-jerk reaction to Tekken starting in March. They also could have been working on it since Pac-Man came out in late '94. I doubt they waited until March. Sega knew Tekken was coming. Simply upgrading the graphics on their already finished game would be enough to show the Saturn can do a Tekken killer. Creating Remix was an extremely smart decision on Sega's part, being able to match their chief competition in a fast and efficient development process. So fast, they got it done by May 11th. So why did Sega hold on to Remix? I am not, and never have been, a professional video game developer or publisher. I understand that in the 90s, getting thousands of copies of a finished game translated, printed, and shipped took weeks. I also understand that based on our Shiro interview with former Sega graphic designer Ken Lowe, Sega knew they were going to surprise launch the Saturn in America multiple months in advance. It was strictly kept under wraps. Even Sega away team devs making launch games didn't know. So if Sega as a whole wanted to ship American Saturns with Remix, there's a good chance it was possible. But they didn't. Instead, early buyers got a flawed port of a 1993 fighter. Still impressive for a brief period of time, but an empty show of force when the Saturn was clearly already capable of Remix. Perhaps they thought people really wanted a one-to-one port. Maybe Sega of America was kept out of the loop on Remix. It's also possible they thought making multiple Virtua Fighters would make them more money, which doesn't make a ton of sense in hindsight since they gave away a bunch of copies for free. I'm sure the decision-making process behind Remix was complicated. Publishing any game back then was not simple. After all, Sega's resources were already tied up with a bunch of other projects. But Virtua Fighter is what crowns Sega as a king, and they need to protect their throne from wannabe kings. Sega eventually put up a proper fight. But was it worth the wait? Did they hang on to that crown 25 years later? As the long cliched phrase goes, hindsight is 20/20. If Remix launched with the Saturn instead of Pac-Man, would that alone have saved the Saturn, the company, or the franchise? Well, it would be naive for any of us to attempt to answer that question. Far too many factors go into the Sega tragedy tale. If you're gaming in the 21st century and want a good VF Saturn experience, you're obviously going to get a better time with VF2 or Megamix. But if you're looking for more, Remix is anything but disappointing. All the simple, fast action of the original with the cosmetic detail of the sequel. Enough to put a big smile on Chairman Segata's face. I really hope I don't sound like a guy who constantly dumps on Sega. I mean, the Saturn's my favorite console, and the company has produced many unforgettable classics. Sometimes, I feel like my series has been a constant festival of Sega complaints, but I mean, I'm not going to pretend they were perfect. After all, no one hates Sega more than the people who love Sega. Remember the 32X? That benign abscess for the Genesis that Sega used to save face until the Saturn came out? It still wasn't very popular in mid-1995 and seemed to be on its way out the door. But oddly enough, in October, the OG Virtua Fighter got ported to the 32X.
Well, Doc, I've been playing that new Virtua Fighter on my Genesis 32X, and it's so realistic, man.
Even more surprising, to this day, fans praise it as a better conversion than Saturn's Pac-Man. I agree. It used fewer polygons than any version of VF, but was strung together in a successful, functional fashion. No pop-out, just smooth, shiny fighting. I don't know how or why they did it, but I mean, here it is. It plays great.
I win!
Super shot. I missed it just a little.
You play better nights.
When you're watching a TV show, you're a witness to an act of violence. When you play one of these games, you are the murderer.
Ooh, baby. So it's Jim, right? Yeah, Jim. Who's this beautiful one that's with you? Aaron.
この
美人という言葉は当てはまると思います。そう、美人。It's fun to say 美人。美人。